Hi, welcome to ECA's podcast with Alison Warner and Dan Jackson, also known as Dan's the Engineer. And we're here today to talk about growth and prosperity. One of ECA's missions in life is to lead the industry to growth and prosperity, and it offers its members a series of information about upcoming issues. It campaigns government, and it offers members services to help support their business through growth and prosperity. So we're here today to talk about how the challenges that people face in setting up their businesses and going it alone. So, Alison, tell us from your perspective, because you've operated across multiple trades, not just in construction but elsewhere, what you think are the key challenges for somebody, specifically a tradesperson, in going from an employment position to setting up their own business.
Well, I think it's first and foremost, it's kind of you don't know what you don't know. And that, to a certain extent, goes for any business. Setting up on your own in business, I think you have to be tremendously committed and driven, and you need to know why you're doing it. You know, it can't just be about the money. You have to have a bigger purpose as to why you're doing it. But there is so many different aspects to running a business, and often people just don't know enough about the different aspects. And why would they? They've been trained in their craft, but at no point in their training has anybody ever talked to them about the numbers or hiring people, developing them. So it cases, as I say, of you don't know what you don't know. But the good news is there's lots of different people out there that can provide you with that help and advice. So I think finding a good accountant is really, really key. That's probably the most important thing to do when you're first setting out.
And Dan, we're in an industry where construction, £10 billion economic contribution, 3 million jobs, M&E, the mechanical electrical sector supports on average 40 to 50% of the cost of any job. But it's an industry of 300,000 businesses, 99% of which are SMEs, and 84% of that 99% are single-person businesses. Supply chains range from simple to, but on average, 4 to 5 levels deep. That means we're very, very highly concentrated with small businesses, micro businesses. As somebody who was trained as an electrician, was an apprentice and came up through the ranks, what were your experiences, your personal experience about going from that change from an employed to I'm on my own and I want to run a business for myself?
It's a huge mindset shift, massive mindset shift, because you've gone from an electrician who is technically minded, practical skills and everything that you've learnt from an apprentice to a business owner, and it's very, very different because the skills you need to learn and need to know, they're completely alien to you. So it's a whole new learning process. So my personal journey was, the growth personally was immense and crazy, because one night I'm running a project in Nottingham, the next thing you know I'm employing people. And it was very, very quick, hit the ground running very, very quickly. And it took me a long time to get out of that electrician phase into I'm a business owner. And it was a long journey. And I wish I had the guidance, because I didn't have it. So there's so many things that I've stumbled across, and you learn as you go. But you're never going to start with a perfect product, almost. I don't think, it's quite difficult to do that. And I think as a business owner, you have got to go through that journey and learn it anyway.
If you knew what you knew now, would you have been brave enough?
Oh, God, I get asked this all the time. Would I set up another contracting company? The reason I'd say no is just because what I do for work now is very different, and how I make my money, and that is my past. But I believe if I was to do it now, I would accelerate success much quicker. But it is hard. I would have to take a deep sigh and go, here we go again.
Okay.
It's not easy.
And Alison, on a very personal level, do you think there's a right time in life, in terms of circumstances, not necessarily age or demographic, but simply about overheads, whether you're living at home or your partner's got a stable income, to make that jump? Is there a right place to start?
That's an interesting question. I think it's very much down to the individual. I have worked with one particular trade's coming to mind who was still living at home with his parents, so you could argue he had less personal expenses and therefore less risk and maybe a bigger chance of being successful sooner. But I think a lot of it just comes down to somebody's individual drive and enthusiasm and how self-aware they are and how willing they are to accept advice. And that you can find somebody of early 20s that has that mindset. Equally, somebody who's older has life experience. So it's kind of horses for courses, really.
So if you're on the tools, Dan, how do you learn? If you're on the tools and you're trying to learn it almost overnight skills that will help you run the business.
You seek guidance from people who are competent in that field. Competence is a really important thing, and obviously electricians are competent at electrical work, but they're not competent necessarily at accountancy. And there's certain health and safety legislation outside of just electrical that you need to know. Marketing you're not competent in marketing unless you learn that as well. So seeking guidance from other people is really important. And kind of going back on what Alison said there about when the time is right and what she said about having a good accountant. Finance, what I come across a lot of my clients that struggle is having the capital, the money there, because you've got a massive mountain to climb and money buys you time. And a lot of them struggle. I mean, I have a lot of small business owners that might have a couple of people working for them, and if they have £1,000 pop up, a van might have a problem and they've got to pay £1,000, they get really stressed out and they struggle because £1,000 to them is a lot of money. But in the grand scheme of things, that shouldn't really affect them. You need that running capital.
So if you looked at the mountain analogy that we used, and this is a path you take and there are certain obstacles or challenges along the way, is there a natural order, Alison, with your experience across multiple trades, where these challenges are typically experienced by tradespeople and there's a priority to them? So you've mentioned financial literacy.
Very much. A lot of it comes down to understanding the numbers. And again, that's in any business. It's almost, if you've got a financial forecast laid out, look at showing sales and expenses and expected profit, that's your map. And nobody knows the future, but you can take a best guess at it, and that can be one tool that guides you in your decision making. We know that £85,000 worth of turnover is a pinch point. There's several pinch points as businesses grow, but 85,000, that tends to be about the maximum that a business owner can turn over without starting to employ somebody else. Now, that might not be a PAYE, it could be a subcontractor, it could be getting some assistance with admin by outsourcing, but 85, 100, that's kind of the max. Beyond that, then it involves others, and of course, as I always say to people, that's the hardest thing in any business, is managing the people, because everything else is tangible, it's black and white, but people aren't. And so that's a big skill in any business to, if you can become proficient at managing and inspiring and leading a team, then you'll be successful.
Okay, and we know that because we're such a fluid workforce, that we go from project to project in this industry. We know from Brexit analysis that on the average contractor in our sector directly employs 65% of his workforce and tops up with labour only self-employed, as you mentioned, or agency labour from elsewhere. Does it therefore become hard to get the stability to make that decision, Dan?
It does, yeah. And it depends what kind of line of work you're in. I mean, just going from my experience, managed to bag decent sized contracts where you can see the future in a much clearer light. I mean, obviously that money isn't guaranteed, but you can see it in a much clearer light than, say, if your jobs were just coming in. It might just comes to mind if you market and it's all about the small jobs, because things can happen. If someone gets hurt within your team or yourself, you can have setbacks. But if you've got bigger contracts, for example, yeah, they come with risks, but at least you can see that the money's coming in. But you need to get to a point where you can at least see that future revenue coming in rather than nothing being there. And what a lot of people they look at inquiries as revenue, and that's not the case.
The old Karelian trick. Let's account for work in progress as done deal and certain income, when in actual fact it may or may not arrive.
Yeah, exactly.
And you mentioned, I mentioned employment, where perhaps we look at our bank balance throughout the month until the next payday. But Alison, you mentioned actually having a better skill set than purely looking at balance or bottom line. Do you want to expand on that for us?
Yeah, often I find that people have their revenue coming into one account, the business bank account, and in the worst cases, they're not paying themselves each month. So they're just dipping into that bank account. I read an interesting book recently called Profit First, which talks about this analogy of trying to lose weight. And there's a particular method, I think it's in the States, where they just reduce people's plate sizes. So by purely giving them a smaller plate, they eat less food. And it's kind of the same managing your business bank account. If you take the money out and have a separate account for tax, a separate account for running the business, pay yourself a salary, then you have a smaller plate, so to speak, with the business bank account, and you can see actually what you have got left, as opposed to just seeing all the money in there and spending it all and then getting to the end of the year and wondering how you're going to pay your corporation tax.
Yeah, and this is where technology and software comes in, and a lot of business owners I come across look at their bank balance as obviously a method of measuring how much money they've got, but really should be using software like I'm going to say the word Xero, which is fantastic, but also understanding the figures a little bit more, because with the software you can look more into the future and it's real time, and especially if you reconcile it automatically with your bank.
So scenario planning.
Yeah, totally. Yeah, and it makes it easier. Like a business owner I spoke to the other day, I said, "What software are you using?" And he said, "I just give it all to my accountant." And a lot of accountants I come across, they're just data inputters. You just give them some figures at the end of the financial year, or depends where your business is. If you have to, VAT or whatever, it's more regular. They just give them figures, and they have no understanding. Whereas it's worth paying a decent price for an accountant that actually kind of oversees that for you, and you can have regular meetings to understand the numbers more, to understand where you need to be. Because
that must be quite a tough challenge. Sorry to interrupt there. It might be quite a tough challenge because there are all sorts of service suppliers out there. You have those who offer bookkeeping services, and when you start being employed and go to self-employed, and you figure, I'm willing to give up protection due to discrimination you get in employment, I'm willing to give up certain other aspects and go self-employed because the tax advantages to my personal structure are there. Certain items can be taken out of your gross income, etc. However, if you only buy into the lowest level financial support, that is, as you described, Dan, bookkeeping, how do you find that level of financial support that helps you scenario plan? How do you find whether it's Xero, Coins, Sage, QuickBooks, or any other products from a software perspective that are going to help you do the scenario planning?
I've got a very simple answer to that. You go to a business coach.
Yeah, it's interesting you should say that.
Good segue.
But it's just made me think. I think there's a massive gap in the market for, and probably in schools. I haven't got kids, so I'm not really too sure what they're teaching kids at schools nowadays. But financial literacy. So many accountants and bookkeepers wouldn't necessarily offer that skill, that advice. As Dan says, they're being paid to enter data. One of the things that we do is look at costs as a percentage of sales, because that is a really good indicator of how the business is running. So, for example, in a trade business, generally speaking, materials should be around 35% of sales. There might be a little bit more, there might be a little bit less, but that's a really, really strong indicator. If it's not, let's say it's 45%, that's straight away an alarm bell for me. That could show that there's wastage in the business, there's theft in the business, they're not charging enough. There's all sorts of questions I can then ask by doing that calculation.
Can I ask if that differs between trades? Because I'm going to say the lifts and escalators, for example, have a much higher level of materials. Dan, you can comment in a second. Mechanical, big items of kit. Electrical, lots of high volume of smaller items of kit, presumably.
Yeah, and also if you there's a lot of electrical companies that just do testing, which is labour.
But is there actually, going back to growth, a point at which mostly you're given free issue materials by your client because you're really an installer, so you are hired in labour? Is there a pinch point at which you're then expected to start supplying?
But one thing I done with my business when I first started up was to get the clients to pay for the materials, and we supplied labour just because we didn't have the cash and the buying power. So they got a bargain because there was no markup on the materials. So, and we supplied the labour just to build the bank balance. It was a relationship between us and the client. And that's something else that's really important, is relationships and sort of partnerships. But there was like a trust thing there. They needed the work doing. We didn't have the cash. And it was just understanding where we both stood with each other. But we got to a point where we could buy the materials, and then they accepted that. But a lot of business owners won't be in that position. That was quite rare. But it's just a tactic that we done to get the money in. But it's but generally speaking, I mean, it can vary, between trades, I guess.
Yeah, I've come across a few trades that do that. Builders can often do that as well. So, yet to your point, absolutely, I'm sure we work primarily with, I guess, builders, plumbers a lot, and electricians. But I did work with a shutters company recently, and their materials were 56%. And upon further investigation, we found that the supplier actually was willing to reduce their prices. And they're now back kind of where they should be. So, but
you also need the tools to be able to look at that, don't you? Like, that's where software comes in handy.
Yes.
And a lot of electricians who set out on their own, even as a one-man band, even having people working for them, I ask them what their day rate or price is, and they might say £200 a day, and I'm like, how did you come to that figure? And they go, well, because everyone else charges that. I'm like, well, you cannot run a business like that. You need to know, because everybody's overheads are slightly different. It's not a set model. And again, it's just trying to educate them on the numbers. And like you said, what they teach in schools.
Well, even from my perspective, so my expertise is in contracts and the legal issues. Not many people really understand the true nature of day work rates, for example, which is a method contractually of pricing variations. But the day work rates are the calculated rates per grade for each qualification of tradesperson, including the employer's overheads, set out in the national agreements negotiated with the unions. Each person will still have to put a percentage markup depending on their geographic location and their individual overheads, which may cause them to win or lose a job. But that's how those rates come about, because there is almost a scientific formulaic process for taking the hourly rate that the individual gets paid and then scaling it up through the business to see what the employer would charge on for in respect of its central and site-based overheads. So yeah, I get that. Intelligence and management information rather than pure raw data. Alison Warner, thank you very much. And Dan Jackson, Dan's the engineer, thank you too.
Thank you for having me.
Thank you.